It's Wednesday, September 3rd, 2014, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, President Barack Obama says he doesn't have a strategy yet for dealing with ISIS in Syria. Just how big of a gaffe was that slip of the tongue? Senator Kirsten Gillibrand accuses some of her male colleagues of harassment. CNN's Dana Bash says she's experienced similar comments too, but neither women will name names, should they? And keeping Ferguson fresh on the public's mind, we'll look at some of the angles St. Louis publications are seeking out to do that. There's a lot more, hopefully we'll get to as well, but let's start with the death of another journalist at the hands of the Islamic State. That is the death, of course, of Steven Sotloff. Yesterday, militant Islamic group ISIS released a video claiming it beheaded Sotloff just 2 weeks after killing journalist James Foley. Like Foley, Sotloff was a freelance journalist, having worked in the past for several big-name publications. He was kidnapped last year while reporting on the civil war in Syria. In the video released by ISIS, Sotloff describes himself as paying the price for the Obama administration's decision to strike ISIS targets in Iraq. This was threatened a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of fatalism in the coverage of this because it was fully expected to happen. In fact, I noticed a little tiny bit of pushback from Sotloff's family. One of the friends who asked not to be quoted by name was a little bit upset that the Obama administration had basically been saying up front that maybe he died at the same time as the previous journalist who was beheaded, and that kind of made the whole thing seem like, well, give up, don't try, he's going to die. But on the other hand, as we said on our last show, as the New York Times reported a few weeks ago, because the U.S. and the British government don't pay ransom, and a lot of European countries do, though they won't admit it, Americans and Brits are, their fate is pretty much sealed.
I think this is another one of those situations where you have this group taking extreme measures, but also using social media to publicize what they're doing, and it's sending shockwaves throughout the world. And it may be a way to galvanize, I think, the Western powers and some other powers in the Middle East to actually take some action against them. So this could turn out to be something that they kind of wish they hadn't done.
I hope that's true. On the other hand, they're very careful. I mean, the ISIS folks have a very strong understanding of how to use media, social media, traditional media, and their target is not the West unless it's Western recruits. Their target is young people to prove to them that they should join up because unlike other folks before them, they have a state, quote unquote, and you see all of this great video of them winning these battles and basically telling all their enemies, get out of our way.
I think the point you make about social media is very important because they're showing that they can reach the public in ways that Al-Qaeda wasn't able to do, other groups that have been out there, and the fact that they have Westerners as a part of their group. And I think that they're more than just fighters. I think that they're also helping them to understand what social media can do. So I think that that's really helping them in terms of the PR aspects of this.
Another interesting point that one of our colleagues brought to me this morning had to do with how this is being portrayed on social media and the idea that so many traditional news organizations are consciously making the decision and making it clear that they are to not show either the video, to not even show still frames of that video. Yet we keep seeing it again and again and again as it appears in Facebook feeds, and sometimes how social media algorithms work or requirements to get news in front of the audience through Facebook or other programs that you have to have some kind of a thumbnail image or it'll lower the ranking, and that kind of defeats those conscious decisions being made.
I guess that is true to a certain extent, but I also think news organizations have been learning over time how to cope with the pressure that comes from social media, posting content that they would rather not show because of their own journalistic standards. Yes, there are some technical impediments that you mentioned, but I think we're getting a little bit better at holding the line on this kind of thing.
And I also think that at least in this latest beheading, that the media knew it was coming, and they were a little bit out in front of how they were going to deal with it in terms of releasing the information, verifying the information, and then how they were going to present it. So I think that as this continues to happen and we begin to see more and more of these, that the media is going to come up with a way to deal with it that presents the information to the public but does not glorify.
More measured or tempered.
Very measured, very tempered way of releasing that information.
Last Thursday, President Obama held a news conference to talk about foreign policy and the devolving situation in the Middle East in particular. NBC's Chuck Todd asked him if he planned to seek congressional approval for military action against the Islamic State in Syria.
As our strategy develops, we will continue to consult with Congress, and I do think that it'll be important for Congress to weigh in, and or that our consultations with Congress continue to develop so that the American people are part of the debate. But I don't want to put the cart before the horse. We don't have a strategy yet. I think what I've seen in some of the news reports suggests that folks are getting a little further ahead of where we're at than we currently are.
So it looks like the president was maybe trying to buy some space there, buy some time before making public any kind of a response. But at the same time, that being non-committal made it look like he didn't really know what he was doing there.
I mean, you can say on the one hand also that journalists need to provide some context, not just pull that little quote out, but that was a major mistake. I mean, that ranks right up there like clinging to guns or religion, or when Mitt Romney talked about the 47%. This is a really big deal because it reinforces existing stereotypes or beliefs or accurate information that people have about the president's foreign policy.
But I agree with you. It is a major gaffe, and it does open a window. But I also think that on the other side, you have a lot of people who are basically saying he's trying to be measured in how he deals with this, because he's getting a lot of push from both parties to do something militarily, to do something to stop ISIS. And I think one of the things that he's doing is like, wait a minute, we need to work with our partners. The last thing we need to do is go off into some sort of military conflict without having a game plan, without working with our partners, without knowing what the situation is. We're pulling out of Afghanistan now. We pulled out of Iraq. The last thing we want to do is go into this. So that's the way he's trying to, I guess, frame the argument. The problem is we in the media and those who are opposed to President Obama are using that gaffe over and over and over again.
Well, and I would say it's probably not going to change the president's behavior, because he's made it clear on any number of foreign policy issues, whether we agree with him or not in the positions he's taken, that he is going to stand back, he's going to be cautious, he's going to take the long view, whatever description you want to use for it. On the other hand, I thought there was a really good quote in, I think it was the NBC News piece that you published on our blog, where they quoted a political science professor who said, I think it was an honest statement. Whether it was a wise statement remains to be seen.
I do think that it was an honest statement, but I also think that it was one of those things where what he wanted to say was, we don't have a defined,
that we don't necessarily have a good strategy
or defined strategy, and we're still working on a strategy. And if he had said that, then
it may have been nothing. It would have blown.
Well, I don't know if it would have been nothing, because your enemies will use almost anything. But I do think that it would not have blown up the way it has.
And to show you just how complex and sort of ironic this whole situation is, if they're looking to formulate a strategy that works, somebody that the president might talk to is Vladimir Putin. The same ISIS folks targeted him in a video this week, and clearly the Russians have some influence in the Middle East in places that we don't. Let's see how that conversation happens in the midst of all that's going on in Ukraine.
Well, interestingly enough, former Obama spokesman Robert Gibbs went on MSNBC's Morning Joe and talked about how hard it is to sit by and watch when a gaffe like this happens.
We all know it was a slip. But that obviously everybody in the White House had to gasp when he did that, right? You've been there when, he's human. Mistakes are made.
I think whenever you have to go out next and say what somebody meant to say or what somebody was trying to say, means you're trying to explain that wincible moment that you see.
I mean, to me, it's one of those things, and I say this to my students all the time. It's not what you meant to do, it's what you did. And you try to pull it back as best you can, but it's still out there. and you can try to explain it away as best you can. But at some point, you're just going to have to directly come out and answer it, and I don't think that they've actually done that yet, or I don't even know if they can.
True, but the difficult thing is that we as journalists also criticize politicians for parsing every single thing they say and doing nothing but going to their talking points. When stuff like this happens and the whole world comes down on your head because of it, you're going to be more inclined to manage the message and less inclined to do it.
And less inclined to be willing to give accurate, I won't say accurate, but honest information about what's going on, because you're pillared and vilified for it.
Yeah.
There was another very small, well, at least from where I sit, it should have been a very small issue that came out of this news conference on social media and then into our nightly newscast in the morning news the next morning, Obama's tan suit. And Ernest, seeing you wearing a light jacket here, to me, it makes it even less of an issue.
I think within the general populace, you probably had more people commenting on the fact that he was wearing a tan suit than the gaffe that he made. I think within the political arena, they talked about the gaffe. But everyone else, I mean, Twitter blew up because he walked out, had on a tan suit, and everybody was going like, "Whoa, wait a minute! You know, we know it's summer, but you're the president, tan." And it was sort of shocking for those who see their presidents in a certain way.
No, and you know, with all of the infotainment focus of a lot of the news that we see these days, that was going to be mentioned anyway, but it also plays into, I have to say, the narrative, the president who was off on vacation while the world is burning, and now he comes back with his casual
and he's still on vacation.
Not taking it seriously.
Yeah.
Well, so a bit ago we were talking about ISIS and how it releases so much of its message using varied media techniques, posting video of beheadings on YouTube, photos of suicide attacks on Twitter. Well, a Muslim cleric, Anjem Chowdhury, told CNN's Brian Stelter that he wants to use that online media to show how Western journalists are, as he says, quote, the propaganda machine of the Obama machine. Stelter asked Chowdhury why he would agree to appear on shows like Sean Hannity's on Fox when he knows that they're only going to break down into shouting matches.
And I know that Sean Hannity is going to interrupt. I know that he's been very rude to some of his guests. But at the end of the day, in between that, I can try to pass the message of Islam. I can try to counter some of those arguments. You know, if there's going to be a platform which is constantly being used against Islam or Muslims, I think from time to time you can go there. You know, I don't mind if they insult me or they insult, my own behavior. But at the end of the day, I believe that the truth would prevail. And I think that you can see from the reaction on the social media that, you know, I won that debate and many people are looking at what I actually said and they're ignoring what Sean Hannity is saying.
You talk about wanting the truth to prevail, but here's what bothers me. When we were setting up for our interview here, the audio engineer asked you to do what every guest does, to count to 10, to check the mic. And you started to do that, but then you said 9/11, 7/7, 3/11. Is this all some sort of a joke to do that?
Well, you know, if you had a sense of humor, maybe you would have laughed. It was just a sound check, you know, and you shouldn't take any of these things that seriously. Obviously, you know, I'm not saying to carry out an operation.
A sense of humor.
We were setting up the sound check, and I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, 11, 7, 7, making sure that you can hear me. It's not a big issue. It's not a big deal. If you want to make it a big deal, by all means do so. But it makes you look much more shallow, really, than me.
I have nothing more to say.
So that was the last 90 seconds or so of about a 10.5-minute interview that was, at times, quite contentious. If you want to watch the full thing, you can on our links blog. If you were able to see that video, it was very clear during some of those pauses that Brian Stelter was losing his patience. Rightfully so, or is that screaming head interview style something that we're just not used to seeing on CNN?
I don't know. I respect Brian Stelter a great deal, but I think he lost his cool, or there was a deliberate attempt by producers to suggest that he ought to be confrontational with his guest. But either way, if you watch the whole interview, he starts out actually, I think, Stelter scoring some points, talking about how it was the Western media that have often told the stories about Muslim victims of war and all of that. So how can you basically, you know, condone the beheading of a Western journalist? But I also thought he kind of got whiny a little bit and made it all about the journalist and not about, you know, thousands of other people who've also suffered at the hands of ISIS. And just even though the clerics, I think his point of view personally is despicable, he came across as a much more rational and cool character. So I don't think that Stelter did himself any good there.
I would agree with you, Mike. I watched this live this past Sunday morning. I just happened to have it on. And during the whole process of the interview and the back and forth, it was sort of like he kept his cool. And Stelter became more and more agitated. I agree with you. I think he started off the interview. He was bringing up some good points. He had a rational argument, but he was dealing with someone who has been in the one-on-one wars with Sean Hannity and all the others. And I don't think Brian has been in that sort of environment long enough to handle that. And as Brian as his argument began to sort of fall apart, the whole discourse just fell apart. And then you get to this last point, which I think, Brian just totally lost it.
Well, I've heard some people actually that were criticizing CNN and the Reliable Sources program, people who aren't in our industry, wanting to know why, if this guy would have done this with the sound check and inserting the 9/11-77, why wouldn't the producers at CNN or Brian Stelter said, enough of this, we're not going to go ahead and give you the platform, cancel the interview, move on? I have a couple of practical reasons as a TV producer. I have 10 minutes of my show to fill, but from kind of more of a big J journalism standpoint.
I thought about that as I was watching it live. I was sitting there going, why are you giving him a platform? Why is he even on the show? And even toward the end of it, I was saying the same thing. I just don't see how it really adds any value to the discussion about what's going on in the Middle East right now. It's pretty much the same old talking points that we've heard over and over and over again. And I would think that a show like Reliable Sources would have brought something new and fresh to the program, and that's not what I saw.
I go back and forth, and I think it's a legitimate question to ask. But I also think that in between some of the rhetoric, this cleric was providing a point of view that folks far less radical than him adopt in trying to have the West understand why some of these things are going on there. And more information is better than less information from my point of view.
I agree with you on that point, but I think it could have been in a better format if it would have been more of an edited format as opposed to this give and take back and forth.
Several segments, we don't know if this segment was live or pre-recorded. Several segments for that program are now pre-recorded. It isn't 100% live as it once was. Let's talk about another joke, one that some don't find quite so funny. New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand is at the center of some buzz in the nation's capital. In her new book, she accuses some of her male colleagues of engaging in boorish and inappropriate behavior, commenting on her weight, body type, and exercise habits. In her book, she recalls one instance during which a Southern congressman held her arm while walking her into the House chamber, saying, Kirsten, you're even pretty when you're fat. And she said another example, one she considered to be the worst, happened soon after that. It was after she had a baby and had lost 50 pounds. Gillibrand writes about an older senator approaching her from behind, squeezing her waist and saying, "Don't lose too much weight now, I like my girls chubby." The story has prompted some observations from several female journalists. NBC's Andrea Mitchell spent time covering Congress in the 80s and 90s. She said they all have their stories of whom they'd avoid getting into an elevator with or whom they'd protect young female interns from. And CNN's Dana Bash says she's experienced it personally, in fact, not too long ago.
I haven't had comments like that, but after I had my son 3 years ago, I got some comments that would just maybe blow you away from male senators, maybe not realizing that they were saying inappropriate things, but talking about, getting my figure back and things like that.
Wow, and you're like, thanks, personal,
yeah, thanks.
Step away.
Now, Kirsten Gillibrand is an elected official making these claims about other elected officials. She has her reasons for not naming names. What are they?
Well, I think basically she has to work with these senators. Mm-hmm. I mean, she has been on the forefront of a lot of legislation, pretty important legislation in terms of having to deal with with women and women's issues. One of them is the sexual assault in the military. She spearheaded that. Now she's working with the sexual assault on college campuses. She's spearheading possible legislation in that area. So she's got to work with these senators to try to get that legislation passed. To go out and name names now may endanger that legislation, and that is going to create a bigger platform for her, and also deal with some pretty important issues.
Yeah, I mean, Dana Bash and the other women journalists face the same kinds of situations. I mean, they're trying to have a career and uncover stories, and they've got to have sources, really good sources, to be able to get some of those stories or perspectives from government leaders. And you know what would happen if they call these folks out by name? They're going to lose some valuable sources. They're going to have a harder time doing their job. So, you know, I understand how we would all like to know who these people are, and probably the public would benefit from knowing who these male senators are who are doing this kind of thing. But I don't think we're asking male journalists to do the same kind of, you know, to decide I'm going to be this or that rather than to be both. And frankly, most of the people who are calling for naming of names, I notice in all the posts and columns, are guys.
The other thing is that, and I read this in an article yesterday about this, is that a lot of the senators, I think some of the senators she's talking about are from the old guard. And many of them, if they haven't already announced that they're retiring, will probably be announcing that they're going to retire pretty soon. The younger males within the Senate aren't the ones who are doing this. And also you have to take into account that we have more women senators now than we've ever had, and that number is going to go up.
Now, Dana Bash, though, is a journalist who's going on the air and saying this. Does she have, is there a different level of expectation there?
Well, she was reacting to a deliberate choice by Gillibrand in her book tour to talk about it. So I think it was kind of off the cuff, and I don't know that she has any particular, you know, requirement that she tell more than she did. I'm not even sure that, I don't think the senator does either. I mean, it'd be nice if perhaps she were willing to do that, but in her circumstance, as Ernest, I think, laid out very well, she's not going to, and you wouldn't expect her to.
Okay.
I will say one other thing about this, by the way, just before we go to the next topic. This kind of thing happens a little closer to home, too. I mean, I can remember a time only a few years ago when we had a state senator in Missouri, in Jefferson City, who had the same kind of reputation, and we warned female student journalists going down there to watch out for this guy. And, you know, nobody ever wrote any stories about it, but this kind of thing is pretty prevalent in government at all levels.
I think it's not only something prevalent in government. I think it's something that's prevalent in business. It's something that's prevalent in sports journalism, with women as well, having experienced it personally. So government is just one sector. I want to take some time to talk about what we've been seeing play out in the media since our last conversation as it relates to Ferguson. Ernest, you sent us an op-ed the late part of the week that we've put on our links blog for everybody to take a look at. What is it specifically that caught your eye there?
What caught my eye, this is
it's in the Washington Post.
It's in the Washington Post. It was written by a former professor here. She's now at Emory, Carol Anderson, who was one of my mentors. And she was pointing out, she basically went back and basically gave a historical account of what happens whenever African Americans begin to show some progress in certain areas. There's always a backlash. And if you go and you read this article, like you said, it's on our links blog, it talks about what happened after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, and how Jim Crow came into play, what happened after the Civil Rights Movement and affirmative action, and some of the instances in which the Supreme Court has rolled some of those back. In particular, right now we're dealing with the Voting Rights Act and what's happening with that in terms of voter ID laws and those sorts of things. And now we're talking about what's happening in the criminal justice system. And what she was basically saying is that there tends to be this sort of rage on the part of, as she put it, white rage on the part of certain segments of the population who don't like these advancements that tend to happen from time to time. And, you know, the thing I want to bring up, which got me thinking about it, and I think we were talking about it earlier, is the fact that now the media is involved and they're actually covering these stories. I wish that we would have done it earlier in the media, but it's good that we're doing it now. I was just reading right before we came in and taped today that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch asked for freedom of information on Michael Brown. Yes, on his juvenile record. they were able to get it. It showed he had no felonies. It showed that yes, he was involved in some petty minor things, but nothing to the outrageousness that some people said that he had been doing.
The thing about that story that I like is that the Post-Dispatch was willing to get the information and try to clarify what's really the truth and try to tamp down some of these rumors. But I also found it troubling that so that you had the pretty typical reaction before the Post-Dispatch actually did their story. Why are you looking into this? You're just trashing the victim again. Or you even had the Riverfront Times saying, well, we're going to get the juvenile records for the police officer. I mean, the Post-Dispatch had a legitimate reason for asking for those records, and if we just hold back and reserve judgment until we see the stories, sometimes those stories confound our stereotypes.
But to me, this goes back to the point that I've made ever since this came out, which is, if the media had been doing its job in those neighborhoods all the way throughout, then they would have some credibility when it comes to stories like this.
True.
You can't gain that kind of credibility in the middle of a crisis. And that's what they're having to deal with right now. And it's not just the Post-Dispatch, just the media throughout the country.
Okay, before we go, I have one of those eye rollers to talk about, but this may actually be something journalists need to think twice about when doing product reviews. I'm guessing by now you've heard about the knee defender, that device that lets an airplane passenger keep the person in front of them from reclining. That's the one that's ultimately caused a handful of flights to have to divert in the last week or so. Admittedly, we've probably all thought it might be a good idea or an investment to plunk down the $20-some-odd for the device. And heck, according to its website, the USA Today called it the must-have travel gadget. The Washington Post said, if the guy in front of you won't compromise, whip out your knee defender. The reviews go back a decade, but sometimes reviews may come back kind of to bite us a little bit and come back as endorsements when a product goes bad.
Yeah, especially when you have planes being diverted and, people having to get off the plane and marshals coming on and arresting people. I mean, this is one of those instances where was somebody not thinking that this was going to happen?
All I know is, let's put a little context to this. I mean,
sometimes
I'd like to have that device. Sometimes I'd be really angry if somebody behind me used it. But the reason we have those seats that are so narrow is because the airlines are trying to sell cheap seats. We say we want cheap seats and we say we want room, and we're not going to get both.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the conversation that's not being had right now, is the fact that the airlines have done everything possible to bring in more profits, from smaller seats to every bag that you bring on is they're going to charge you for it. We went from having meals on to barely having something to drink. Not even a peanut. Yeah. Not even a peanut. So, and now you're having people fighting on planes because the seats aren't big enough. And I think this is where Congress needs to step in and say, whoa, wait a minute. There needs to be some regulation on the airlines. We understand that we're not going to go back to when everything was regulated, but there definitely needs to be more regulation involved in this.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today. Check out our links blog under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments or questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Pat Akers for handling the audio. Hope Kerwin and Josie Herrera are our associate producers. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week for another edition of Views of the News.